In our last video, we spoke about selective breeding. In this video, I'm going to focus on the balance between both art and science in developing a breeding program. Welcome to the Art of Breeding with Brian Reeder. It's true that you don't need any science, and I've certainly seen plenty of people breeding plants and animals who clearly have no artistic sense. But if you can bring those two things together, then you really have a powerful set of tools from which to make really innovative choices and powerful directions that you can follow as you pursue a breeding program. For me, I'm lucky in that I grew up both with an artistic sense and with a sense for science, a passion for both. Because I had started reading very young and I had devoured the encyclopedias that we had in our home, I had been exposed to both concepts of art and science. And I loved both, and I wanted to bring both to bear in everything I did. And of course, my whole life I've been told, oh, you've got to pick one thing and stick to it. And I think that is the worst advice anyone can ever be given, unless they're going to be an accountant or a banker or something equally dry and boring. But science without art is just basically fancy mathematics. Art without science is sort of pretension, in my opinion, or maybe just aesthetic. The reason I say that is because I believe strongly that you need to bring a sense of aesthetic to a sense of art. And let me explain. All great artists also have something of the scientist about them. And what I mean by that is great oil painters understand how pigment blends with the oils. They understand how that dries on the canvas. They understand the differences in the type of fibers that go into the making of the canvas. They understand the differences in the types of hair or fibers that are used to make the brushes. So they really have this grasp of a whole range of sciences, even if they don't realize that's science. Beyond that, there are other sciences, mathematical sciences, that every artist needs a good grip on to be a great artist. Mathematics, proportion, perspective. These are all mathematically based things that a good artist really needs to have, if not a natural grasp of, some training in. So, for instance, the golden ratio is so important to balance within any piece of art. And some people will naturally know how to use the golden ratio. They'll know what that is, know how to use it. Other people will have a natural intuitive awareness of that proportion. Humans are naturally drawn to the proportions of the golden mean. And when we see that, we find those things to generally be aesthetically pleasing and balanced. And even though these are things based in science, they're based in mathematics, we tend to perceive them in an aesthetic sense. Now, a good scientist needs to have a certain grip of art. And what I mean by that is they have to have a certain sense for the beauty of what they work with. Even if it's pure mathematics, even if it's rocket science, whatever it is, they are creating through the application of scientific principles. Whether that be the creation of theorem, or whether that be the creation of physical things. If you're not bringing a certain aesthetic to what you're doing, then you're basically just a robot assembling things, or you're just a computer spitting out numbers. So what does this have to do with breeding programs? Well, I know very few people that do not have a target of some kind in mind when they're breeding, whether that's plants or animals. Whatever it is they're choosing to breed, there is some kind of target they're aiming toward. Now, some of us are breeding garden plants, and that's almost purely aesthetic. In fact, that's gone too far into aesthetic. There's not enough consideration in far too many instances of the science that also needs to go with that. Fancy chicken breeders, fancy dog breeders, the purebred dogs, fancy snake breeders. I mean, those who are breeding for aesthetic concerns, the morph breeders, fancy goldfish breeders. That's all aesthetic. Now, on the other hand, you have agricultural production, where the aim is purely on a functional trait. So in corn, it's a certain set of traits for sugar content or for days to maturity. In milk cattle, it's a certain amount of milk. In chickens, it's a certain amount of meat in a certain amount of weeks, or it's a certain amount of eggs in a calendar year. These are all the kinds of things that the production end is looking at, and they maybe get a little far away from aesthetics sometimes. But make no mistake, there's still an aesthetic there, because it's something that is desirable. It's a desirable trait. It may not be purely aesthetic in the sense of beauty and art. It may not be aesthetic to our eyes, but it's still the pursuit of a particular desirable trait. Desire is the essence of aesthetic. What an aesthetic brings up in us is a sense of desire. So I don't know any breeder worth their salt who is producing anything that doesn't have a certain desire to see this target reached, whether that's on the production end or whether that's on the purely aesthetic end. I'll give you some examples from my life. I am an artist. I draw, I paint. My preference is to work with oil. I don't do this professionally. I don't paint consistently, but I've painted my whole life. I tend to like photorealism. My greatest inspiration is Caravaggio. There are many other oil painters that I just adore, including the Impressionists, the Pre-Raphaelites, as well as the Renaissance greats, the Wyeths from the United States. There are just a wide range. Lucian Freud, for instance, is magnificent the way he produces, or the way he produced, he's passed now. His use of color and texture, gorgeous. But I tend to work in a kind of photorealistic style with fantasy subjects, and I tend to work on one or two paintings for 20 or 30 years. And that's because I like for things to dry, so I can go in and do washes. But of course I'm busy with a lot of other things, and so painting could not be my premier focus. And so it may be sometimes 5 years before I get back to put the next wash on for the next layer. I am an actual visual artist, but I also am a designer. I am very good at patterning. I love to create patterns for clothing and costumes. I love to, and I'm good at doing that. Pattern making is a really interesting thing, and I bring this up because when you're making a pattern to create a garment, that is such a balancing act between science and aesthetic. You want this garment to look a certain way, to have a certain function, to have a certain aesthetic appeal. But at the same time, when you're making that pattern, whether you're doing flat patterning or draping, if you get one thing off even the least little bit mathematically, the whole thing's going to be thrown out of proportion. It's not going to look right. So you have to really be both aesthetically and mathematically, scientifically minded when you're creating the patterns. Now, there are pure designers who only do the sketches and they don't make the patterns and they don't do the fabrication, but I personally do all of them. When I create a garment, I create the pattern, I cut that, I fabricate the piece, I finish the garment, and I like to create the whole thing. So the art, and of course it's not always a garment. I mean, it can be other things. I certainly have made quilts. I certainly can sew cushions and covers and all of these kinds of things. So whatever it is, it's still going to apply. It's just that clothing is much more complex than most other things you're going to sew and pattern and create. So there's this balancing act between this. But I also have a love of all the arts. I have a love of theater. I have a strong love of theater. I have a strong love for mask making because I have a love for theater. I'm very influenced by Greek theater, ancient Greek theater, with its comedy and tragedy. I love the creation of illusion on stage. I love the creation of visual effects on stage. And what most people don't understand is that, like in set design, for instance, if you're working in set design, a lot of that is about creating silhouettes and about the tensegrity of the whole unit, the whole stage set, about how it balances each other, about how it tells part of the story. So all of this then applies directly into all of the breeding work and the science research that I've done, because I don't ever look at a breed of chicken, for instance, and say, oh, this breed is just this separate thing over here and it has nothing else to do with any other breeds of chickens. I know chicken breeders who think that, and I mean, I'm not trying to put people down, but that's not real. They did not evolve. Chicken breeds are not a real thing. They weren't created in some creation event, nor did they evolve naturally. We selected them to look the way they look out of stabilized hybrids of later generation deriving from the hybridization of multiple jungle fowl, with the main base stock being red jungle fowl. So to get from a red jungle fowl or a Becazar to a Cochin or an Onagadori or a Polish crested breed of some kind, that's art. That is aesthetic. But it also requires that you have the mind of a scientist to make the selections to get there. Our ancestors were not scientists in the modern sense. They did not have degrees. They were not participating in, academia. They were not publishing papers. But to think that anyone who could take a segregating land race and select it into a cohesive look where all the parts fit together in such a way that that was recognizable and that most of the population had that look, that takes a scientific mind. It takes an artistic vision, and it takes a scientific mind. Now, when I approach breeding of any kind in any way, I'm always going to bring both things to the table. I'm going to look at anything, and I'm going to see the aesthetic. But I'm going to know that to get to that aesthetic, there are certain scientific processes that I need to follow. For instance, okay, I want to give you an analogy that I have made up that I just love, and that is that Leonardo da Vinci did not paint the Mona Lisa on an old, worn-out, snotty piece of tissue paper. Because why would he? If the animal or the plant is not sound, the most beautiful flower in the world cannot make up for that. The most beautiful plumage, the thickest fluff, the longest tail, cannot make up for a weak, sickly bird with low fertility that has breeding problems and that carries a whole bunch of deleterious genes. Again, I don't mean to be mean or hateful or to put down what people are doing. I want to wake you up. And if that takes shocking you a little to wake you up and get you to think about this, then that's what I'm going to do. That's why I'm doing this. I want you to think about the fact that no one lays the foundation of a house and then goes in and hangs curtains. Okay? Color varieties, form, extremes of phenotype. All of these things are the final details. It's window dressing. It is, it's the surface. It's what you see, so you think it's the most important. You think your Polish chickens are only good if they've got the biggest crest, or your Cochins are only good if they've got the most fluff, or your long-tailed breeds are only good if they've got the longest tail. And that's nice, I guess, if that's what turns you on. But there's a chicken under there. The same with daylilies. You think your daylily is the finest thing ever bred because it's got more teeth than everybody else's on the edge of the petals, or the teeth are longer, or it's got more broken patterns in the eye, or it's got whatever the latest trend this week or this year is. But what if the plant under it is hard to grow, doesn't have good vigor, doesn't have good fertility, produces weak offspring? Have you really produced a fine piece of art? You might have produced an ingredient toward making a fine piece of art, but if you don't then take the time to work that out, to take that very fine ingredient over a strong plant until you get a strong plant with this extreme trait, or with a refined trait, or with a more selected trait, then you're not doing everything you could. You're not really practicing the full breeder's art. All you're doing is you are intensifying an individual trait. And we see this across the board. This is the biggest problem at this time in our history with all breeding programs, is that because we don't really have to focus on utility much anymore, and we can focus simply on trivial aesthetic points, we forget that there is an organism under there that we have a responsibility to keep viable. Somehow there's this notion that the harder it is to keep, that's like some kind of cool, like street cred kind of thing. Oh, I spent $6 million last year just keeping it alive. Well, how cool for you. But that's actually kind of sick when you think about it. That thing should be hard to kill, because their wild ancestors are. Get back to me when you find a species daylily that just up and dies. It just rotted. I spent $800 for it, and it lasted 3 weeks and just rotted. Sorry about your luck. Better luck next time. And I don't mean to be harsh or trivial or to trivialize people's interest. I want you breeding extremes. All I'm asking is to apply art and science. If you go too far in the art, you ruin the organism. If you go too far into the science, you lose the art. Find a balance. Have multiple lines. Every daylily in your garden doesn't have to have the most and the longest teeth on its petal edges. You can have multiple lines where you're building strong plants with teeth, and then plants that have the greatest and longest and biggest and most teeth, so you can blend those and create strong plants with the most teeth. That is doable. Now, I know most of you don't want to put in the time or effort. That's what it really comes down to. And then it's also expensive to maintain multiple lines, and you want to be focused on just this one thing. And I get wanting to focus, but you need to learn that being focused can be a broader thing than just doing this one narrow, super narrow vision. In my own daylily program, there came a point where I stopped breeding diploids because tetraploids were always my aim. And once I knew I had the stock to do the tetraploids the way I wanted, I suspended my diploid program. And when I did that, a lot of people came to me and said, "Oh my God, why would you do that?" And I said, "Well, I have to focus." And it's true. You do have to focus. But that means I'm focused on tetraploids. I've got a whole bunch of lines of tetraploids going. Some parts of my program have much fancier flowers. But because they don't have as much species genetics, they have weaker plants. They're not weak. I've selected them out of thousands and thousands of seedlings, and I've selected the strongest ones, but they still are not as extremely vigorous as those that have the higher species quotient. So what I am doing is gradually blending the two, because it is possible to have the strongest plants and also have the fancy flowers. It's possible, chicken people, to have hardy, vigorous, productive birds that lay well and are very fertile and have a good amount of meat on their bones, whether you eat them or not, and also are beautiful and have extreme phenotype traits. Now, I don't want to get too harsh because I know it's expensive to maintain a lot of animals to maintain multiple lines. So I'm going to give animal people just a little bit of a break. But I'm not going to give that to plant people because I know how many daylilies you can maintain on an acre, and you can keep a viable program going. So moving forward, as I make more and more videos, we will be discussing both arts and sciences. We will discuss art and science. We will discuss the balance of the two, and they do not have to be in conflict. This is not art versus science. It is art and science, and that's the name of this video. Thank you for visiting my channel. I hope this video was interesting to you. If you would like to know more about this subject, leave a comment or question below in the comments section. Please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell notification to be alerted when new videos post. You can find my poultry books on Amazon at the link below in the show notes. My daylily website, sundragondaylilies.com, offers information on booking me for consultations on your specific genetics questions or mentoring for your breeding projects. It also lists all of my daylily introductions, the cultivars that are currently available, and links to my blog where you can find the bulk of my daylily writing. Thank you for joining me for this video, and I hope you'll be back for more. Have a great day.